can be associated with animal-derived leather materials, though it's not leather. I believe that leather will never disappear.
What is mycelium?
We all know mushrooms, don't we? But this is nothing else than the fruit of a much larger organism. It's like thinking about the apple being the fruit of the tree. Now, in this case, the tree is not the tree, but it's the mycelium. The mycelium is the real body of the fungus. It's basically, unfortunately, something that usually gets unnoticed because it goes on underground every single where, covering the whole planetary surface everywhere. Some people also assume that it's the glue that is keeping Earth together. And at the same time, and this is not an assumption, is the first internet ever invented by nature, meaning that it's this communication channel across all living systems in the soil through which all life communicates. Without the mycelium, there is nothing. Fungi have cells which are filamentous cells. They are not little dots like in the case of yeast, but they are like long-stranded cells, like a yarn, you could say, but very tiny. And when many yarns come together, they form this intricate network. It's a sort of a non-woven. This network, this cluster of cells, the cells are called hyphae. So many hyphae together form a cluster that we call mycelium. This is what mycelium is, the real fungus.
What are the technical specifications? Is it comparable to leather?
I start with the differences, really the origin. So from which processes our materials come from. First of all, the processes rely, yes, on biofabrication and therefore on employing a living system such as a specific fungal species and strain. But before that, they rely on the valorization of residual compounds. And this is a key aspect for me and for my work at MOGU. It's what comes before everything else. The fact of looking at what many still consider waste as something that doesn't exist. Waste is something we invented. There's no waste existing, there's resources. So we look at those as residual resources that we can feed our fungi, our cultures with, in order to let fungi and the mycelium ferment such nutritious material. And I'm here talking about residues from the agro industry, from the fashion industry, the textile industry, like waste cotton fiber, the dirty fiber full of plant matter. And by feeding these materials to our fungi through very determined attentive processes of fermentation, we are able to partly transform through the fungi such input materials. So let's say that the cellulose that is contained in this material gets transformed in other biopolymers. And by actually being able to assess the quantity and the distribution of such polymers, we can engineer the properties of the materials that derive from the fermentation process beforehand through biology. Now, this is not something you can do with a cow. Another thing you cannot do with a cow is to grow a cow from baby to fully developed cattle in 2 weeks. This is what we do with mycelium. With a cattle, it takes 3 years. Cattle need a lot of space to roam. They need a lot of nutrition. They need a lot of water. They emit a lot of CO2. And, well, of course, we should mention the killing, which is something that society is resonating ever more with, as there's an increasing community of vegan individuals out there that prefer not to consume animal products. In some ways, the advantages that come out of these types of fermentation techniques, which have underlying principles that are similar, but the different players that operate in this space use their own processes, which are fundamentally different. The objective is to be able to obtain a raw material that, following a treatment, and here we make an analogy to the tanning in the leather industry, but it's not tanning per se. Also, the main constituent of a mycelium material such as this is chitin. This is a thin one. We can actually come these days to 4 millimeters, for instance, which is, of course, quite significant. The main constituent is different. Therefore, also the processes of transformation are different. Now, once one goes through that transformation, obtains materials that, physically speaking, in terms of physical qualities, they do have resemblance and can be associated with animal-derived leather materials, though it's not leather. There's been a lot of talking about leather. simply because, first of all, there is a need of switching. And yet, I personally believe, even if I am strongly sensitive towards animal welfare, I believe that leather will never disappear. And it's simply a very specific type of product. What we are here offering is not a competition per se with leather, but a new typology of material, which is offering completely different opportunities that in some cases will surpass leather in terms of how you're allowed to play with it and how you're capable of engineering the material along its growth. And yet physically, it can help to have that type of resemblance. It's like in food. You can make some food innovation, but if you go for a taste that is completely against the grain and that people never experienced, it will hardly be accepted. Of course, leather is what is benchmark in comparison terms when it comes to mechanical properties of the materials and technical properties and to overall physical properties. So actually really textures and so on.